welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dan Sutter, with the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University. The United States, as founding, has been described as being the first nation founded on an idea, and that idea being freedom. Well, freedom has played an important role in the growth and development of the United States, and economists today talk often about the importance of economic freedom and increasing our freedom in the United States and in Alabama as well. Here to talk about some of the a new area of research amongst economists and political scientists involving the measurement of freedom is our guest tonight, Dr. Will Ruger from Texas State University. Welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here at Troy.
Well, you're here in Texas State is a new member of the Sun Belt Conference, and so welcome to Troy. And I know the football team will be visiting here for the first time in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. I've heard it's important for Troy to win that game, but hopefully Texas State does well. It's a good game. Put it that way.
welcome to the Johnson Center.
Thank you.
And you're also a political scientist by training.
Yes.
Well, as economists and political scientists have recently moved into trying to measure economic freedom. We've talked about freedom for many years and certainly recognize the importance of freedom. But why as a professional economist or political scientist is it important to measure freedom?
Well, I mean, we talk a lot about the role of government and how it affects all kinds of outcomes in our life. And if we're going to be careful about looking at that relationship, we need to be able to accurately measure that size of the state, the scope of the state. So one of the things that the Freedom Index does is it allows us to have a comprehensive look at the policies that affect freedom. And that can help us do all kinds of analysis about what effect freedom has on things like economic growth or the decisions of people and businesses to move and any number of different dependent variables or outcomes, as we might say, in the social sciences.
Now, people have a lot of different things that they think of when they hear the term freedom. And so what specifically do you mean by freedom in the context of this index?
Yeah, we have a pretty non-controversial definition of it. It fits very much within the kind of history of Western civilization. Namely, freedom is the ability to dispose of one's life, liberties, and property as you see fit, as long as you don't, as long as you allow others to enjoy that equal freedom. So it's kind of like that old saying that your rights end at the tip of my nose. So you can do what you want with your property and your life as long as you're allowing other people's to also realize that in their own lives.
So anything in terms of like what we hear today about economic rights or the right to a job or right to a wage would not be included in this concept.
Right, they won't be included. I mean, those may be things that people would want in terms of equality or other types of opportunities. I mean, there's lots of potential goods in the world. Right. What we're trying to measure, however, is freedom. If we lump everything into that concept of freedom, it becomes hard to really disentangle any of the effects or even to have a kind of a conversation between each other about the value of freedom versus those other things if we're not carefully specifying what it is and keeping it rather confined, right? I mean, so if I said, bring me a chair, and we've defined a chair as anything with 4 legs, you might not know whether to bring me something like this or to bring me a table that has 4 legs. Right. So we have to really specify what the things we're measuring are, and then to carefully measure those.
So this was the project that you ended up undertaking, or at least the first edition of it. You now have a second edition or updated version.
Yeah, we're actually in the 3rd edition now. Okay. So and this is we like to say bigger and badder. It's been fully revised and expanded. It's a pretty massive project. When you get into these things, you're not really sure, I think, how massive they can get. But in terms of kind of how we, I've told you how we define freedom, but how do we measure it? We're talking about coding for all 50 states, over 200 variables. So we're talking about thousands of data points that we're selecting. in terms of how we kind of construct the index, what it is really is it looks at economic freedom and personal freedom. And in terms of economic freedom, we're really looking at fiscal policy and regulatory policy. Those are each count for about a third of the index. And then personal freedoms, or what you might call paternalism, so restrictions on people's individual ability to educate your children as you see fit, or issues dealing with, say, gun control, or tobacco freedoms, things like that. So it's about a third, a third, a third in terms of fiscal policy, regulatory policy, and kind of personal freedoms.
Now, just going ahead to look at what's specifically included in some of these components of the index that you look at, but I guess we should get a shout out to your co-author on this project.
Indeed. Yeah, Jason Sorens at Dartmouth College is my co-author, and you know, he's been a great partner to work on with this.
And the Mercatus Center at George Mason is.
Right, the Mercatus Center at George Mason is the publisher of it. It's been a great relationship with them that we've had now through 3 editions, and the new edition is just fabulously produced, even just on the kind of look side. It's got some original artwork on the cover, and so we've been very happy with that partnership. And most importantly is kind of getting the message out across the country. And we've had a really great response around the country with a website at www.freedominthefiftystates.org. And you can go on there, and there's a map of the different states, and you can learn all about them, including Alabama, find out where they rank, and you can get the data, and there's some videos on there. So it's a whole range of things if you're interested in kind of comparative state policy, or you just want to see how your state, Alabama, matches up against the others, particularly your neighbors, Mississippi, Georgia, and so forth.
Now, the first area that you mentioned is fiscal policy. Now, before economists and political scientists started constructing these types of measures, we often used, I remember using it in my research, government spending as a percentage of the economy, so government spending as a percentage of GDP, as a measure of the size and scope of government. Now, what are the advantages to the type of analysis you're doing here, say, on the area of fiscal policy relative to that measure?
Yeah, I mean, all measures are going to be, can be, more or less blunt measures of something. And, there are reasons why, say, aggregate measures like GDP might be valuable in comparing, national economies. For us, actually, tax burden is the biggest part of the fiscal policy area. And we don't specify which types of taxes are better or worse when it comes to freedom, even though economists could tell us which types of tax policies are more or less distortive of economic outcomes. But we're looking at the kind of overall tax bite, because we want to see what kind of burden is placed on citizens, especially given that if you're spending a lot of your precious time working to and a lot of that time is being essentially the product of that in terms of your salary is being taken by your state or local governments, then that's a real restriction on your freedom. Which is not to say that there isn't we're not anarchists. We think that there's certainly a place for the state in particular. The state plays a role in defending individual freedoms when others try to violate that. That being said, the tax burdens we see across the country are well in advance of that, and so it's really a kind of a big problem in many places. What kind of tax bite the government is taking? Places like New York with really high tax burdens, and that's a real problem. And that gets to one of the issues, with economic freedom in particular, is that economic freedom, or the lack thereof, is really impacting the kind of migration patterns we're seeing around the country.
So it's not just government spending that you're looking at. You also have an area to look at regulatory policy.
Yeah, exactly. So what kind of climate there is in terms of government policies that affect businesses and individuals in the kind of decisions they are able to make in their lives in terms of their employment and their production of value for others. So for example, something like occupational licensing.
Right.
This is one of those issues that we maybe don't focus on as much as say, the right to work laws or things like health insurance mandates or kind of bigger labor market freedoms. But, occupational licensing is something that impacts a lot of people that are kind of on the lower rungs of the economic ladder. So think about restrictions on or licenses for hair braiders or for people working in the gardening areas or funeral home attendants, things like that. That raises, it's essentially a kind of barrier to entry for people. It artificially raises the salaries of people in those industries, but we forget the unseen cost to the people who aren't able to get into those areas.
And in terms of freedom, I mean, being able to choose what you want to do with your life in terms for your living, because work is such a big part of our lives. If you don't have the freedom to choose,
right?
Occupation
I
you want to
wouldn't say
pursue.
that that's the most fundamental, but it's among the most fundamental choices you make. And Americans love to work, and that's a great thing, and they define themselves a lot by their work. Americans love to ask each other, so what do you do? And they mean, what kind of job do you have? And you don't necessarily see that in Europe. So we do define ourselves that way. And if that's such an important part of the definition of our life project, the state's ability to kind of restrict that or make it harder for you to pursue your occupation, that's a real violation of your freedom in a way that I think most Americans, if they really looked into it, would find repugnant.
Now, what's sort of interesting or the really innovative element of your project is that you go beyond just economic freedom. You look at personal freedom. And here we have some of the components of personal freedom that you're looking specifically at. So why do you think personal freedom is important and is an important thing to add in compared to some of there are some other measures that try to look at economic freedom across the state?
There are some comparisons of the states on their economic freedom out there. I mean, we think that we do a better job with those things, which is not to say that these other efforts aren't valuable, but we think we do a good job measuring that, and we provide value in terms of economic freedom. So if you just were interested in kind of an economic freedom index, we provide that. But like you said, one of the great things about this study is that we go beyond that to look at personal freedom. And that's because we think that freedom, yes, we can analytically disaggregate it, but freedom is a whole, and we don't just value economic freedom. So a lot of Americans would probably not like to live in Singapore, even though Singapore is an economically free state compared to other states around the country, around the world. But they care about more than just that economic freedom. It's not to say that that isn't valuable. It is quite valuable. Because it's even hard to have some aspects of our personal freedom without economic freedom. So Milton Friedman, the famous economist, in a book called Capitalism and Freedom, talked about how freedom is a totality. We agree with that. And it's important for some of our personal freedoms to have the economic freedom to be able to raise the capital to, say, start a newspaper, or to have the money to buy space or to rent space so that you can have free association. That being said, we also want to know specifically what kind of measures that the government takes that reduce our personal freedom in particular. So for example, even a simple thing like, do you have the right to ride a motorcycle or a bicycle without having to be forced to wear a helmet? Now, I think it's great to wear a helmet. In fact, I think it's probably not a wise move to ride a motorcycle without a helmet on. But I think people should have the freedom to do those things. Now, they should also have to internalize the costs of their behaviors.
Right.
But we have to remember, and I think this is an important point that even a lot of classical liberals or libertarians forget, which is that there's a difference between ethics and politics. Right. Having the freedom to do something doesn't make the exercise of that freedom a wise, ethical, or a good thing. So, for example, people might say, look, gambling, some people might think that's immoral. or smoking marijuana, it might be immoral, or engaging in, the big thing nowadays, which is funny because a lot of people around the country want to free marijuana. At the same time, they want to put more restrictions on cigarettes. Mm-hmm. These are both, kind of mind-altering or mood-altering substances. It's kind of interesting that people have a different, a double standard on that. But, it might be a bad thing to smoke, but that's separate from separate from whether one should be allowed to pursue that. Particularly given that we are a society that wants to respect individual choices. Mm-hmm. So if you're pro-choice about whether you should be able to carry a gun, shouldn't you be pro-choice about whether you can carry a cigarette?
Good point. Now, you mentioned that you have to track hundreds of different variables to this. Mm-hmm. But just for our viewers, what would be involved with going about trying to construct some of these components of the index?
Sure. I mean, some of these are easier than others. You get data from the federal government, particularly some of the fiscal data. That's relatively easy. It's in dollar amounts. Other things are more difficult, where you actually have to go to the statutes in each state and code these policies. And mm-hmm. And a lot of times it can be an art as much as a science, mm-hmm. particularly with things that, are kind of, if there's 50 different legislatures and they're writing things slightly differently and defining, whether this, kind of putting this into a numerical format, as as an economist, can sometimes be difficult, particularly something, that isn't, say, what we call a dichotomous variable, right, where it's a 0 or a 1. Mm-hmm. Do you have a helmet law or not?
Right.
So sometimes it can be quite difficult and time-consuming. It's not just the number of variables, but trying to kind of tease out, how should we code this? Mm-hmm. And then, another thing is just how do you weight the policies? Right. How do you decide, what the value of, say, incarceration rates above the property and violent crime norms? How do you rate that compared to, say, helmet laws, right, or a ban on salvia? Mm-hmm. And in past editions, what we did is we divided it kind of 50-50, personal freedom and economic freedom, and then we tried to place things based on how we viewed kind of the importance and the effect, and whether these policies had kind of constitutional protection that kind of ratcheted up. We think it was more objective. It wasn't merely subjective in that sense, but we wanted in this edition to make it a little bit more bulletproof in terms of people who said, hey, this is just what Ruger and Sorens care about. Mm-hmm. We don't think that was what was going on before, but we wanted to kind of bulletproof it. So what we did is, and this was quite an innovation, we looked at the cost of the policies to the people who would enjoy those policies. Okay. And we used literature and economics and other areas to get at the kind of dollar cost value, say, mm-hmm. Of these policies. Right. And that way we could, then divide up the pie based on the cost. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult, but it gives a kind of check on kind of subjective rankings of these different policies. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, there were things that we thought were probably more important that once we looked at that kind of dollar cost, we realized were actually should be weighted less, and there are other things that should be weighted more. Mm-hmm. So for example, my writing partner and I, we just don't care as much about gambling. And so we didn't really think of it as being as important as when we looked at, how much people care about that compared mm-hmm. to, say, even, restrictions on homeschoolers. Okay. And so I think we have kind of a nice system now where we've kind of stepped back a little bit.
Okay, so let's see. Here we have. Look and see how Alabama fares.
Right.
And so here's Alabama's overall ranks in these different components. Now the economic freedom combines, I think, the fiscal freedom and the regulatory freedom, right? And we can use that to compare with personal freedom. Mm-hmm. And so overall, I guess at Alabama, you could say, about middle of the pack in freedom.
Yeah, I mean it's doing better than a lot of other places, as you can see. I mean, you know, especially compared to, say, you know, places like New York, California, New Jersey, Hawaii, Rhode Island, right? You know, those are some of the worst states in the union when it comes to you know, freedom. You know, but this might surprise some people here in the state. I mean, Alabama's a red state, and a lot of the people in the state care a lot about freedom. It may surprise them the extent to which the government of Alabama does impact not just their personal freedom, but their economic freedom.
And we can see further that, I mean, in fiscal freedom, we're actually doing quite well.
Yeah, and that's largely because the tax burden in Alabama is relatively light, and that's a great thing. Although that does mask the fact that there are a lot of federal inputs into the state.
Okay.
So Alabama is one of the states that actually has relatively high government spending, but it has a relatively low tax burden.
Okay.
And that's because of the intervention of the federal government. But you can see that, you know, the real problem that Alabama has is that it has a relatively paternalist view when it comes to personal freedom, and then how people operate in the market in terms of their kind of regulatory freedoms. Now, Alabama is a right-to-work state, but there are lots of other restrictions. And really some of the biggest troubles in Alabama and ways that they could improve would be, for example, to improve their liability system. And that's probably a story that most people here in Alabama know about, how there's a lot of tort abuse in the state. But in terms of personal freedom, you have really high incarceration rates in the state. And again, we're not anarchists. We think that the state has a role in protecting individuals from violent and property crimes, and those folks that commit those crimes should be prosecuted and incarcerated if the crime is severe enough. But even controlling for that, in other words, taking into account the level of property and violent crimes that occur in Alabama, your incarceration rates are still a lot higher than places across the country. And that's not only bad because you have lots of people that may be incarcerated for what we might call victimless crimes, but it's very expensive for the state to have to incarcerate people that are hardly threats to people's personal property or kind of bodily sanctity.
So what does the evidence show? How important is economic freedom and personal freedom for things like growth or migration between the states?
Yeah, I mean, we care about freedom because it's an intrinsic good. You know, so even if there weren't necessarily good outcomes, let's just say it was a wash, right? Then we would still care about knowing what the level of freedom is in our states. Right. But there's also what we found in this study is that freedom has a huge impact on economic growth. It has a big impact on the decisions people make to move. So two of the big findings from the study, one is that people are voting with their feet. So places that are more free are attracting people from other states and their businesses. And states that are less free are pushing these people out of the state. Now you might say, well, hey, you know, people are moving to places like Texas from New York, or Florida from New York, or Arizona from New York, because Arizona has, at least according to many people, better weather, although I like the snow and the winter. But people would say that. Well, we're taking account of the fact that there's different climates, and these are attractive climates. We control for cost of living. We control for certain types of amenities that other states have. And what we're still finding is that it's statistically significant result, namely that people are moving, at least on the margins, because of freedom, and that's showing up in the data. And we really see that in a place like New York, for example. New York, this is kind of unbelievable in many ways. New York lost 9% of its 2,000 population between 2000 and 2011. You know, that's remarkable. And the only reason this probably hasn't become a big story is because we don't see New York's population slipping by 9% because they're getting people coming from other parts of the world, right? Immigrants. And if you're coming from Burma, or you're coming from Sweden, New York might look pretty good.
Yeah.
But the fact is that of the people who were living there in 2000, 9% of those people left. You know, and they're being pushed out. And particularly if you go upstate,
Right.
you know, the kind of regulations and taxes that people in Manhattan may be able to deal with, it's really crushing people upstate. And we also see that in places like Illinois, California. Both Illinois and California lost approximately 4% of their 2000 population over that time. And they're going to freer states. So at the same time Illinois is losing 4% of its population, Indiana is staying about average, even though Indiana is relatively similar. In fact, you could argue that given that Illinois has Chicago, a great city, that it's surprising that Indiana hasn't lost even more. But Indiana has stayed about average, or stayed about the same. And I think that shows you that kind of within a region, if you're more free than your neighboring states, you can attract citizens and businesses. And I think Indiana is a state that's going to do a lot better in the next decade or two because of the policies they've put into place in terms of attracting citizens. And Illinois is going to do worse. And we all know about all the folks from California leaving.
Right.
You know, and Governor Perry of Texas likes to go to California, try to attract businesses. He doesn't need to go to California. Texas just has to keep that kind of competitive advantage in terms of its public policies. And this is something that maybe Alabama could do here is, you know, if Alabama really wants to attract people to the state and attract more jobs and increase economic growth of its citizens, it would be great if it could be the freest state in the country like North Dakota is. But even if it just wants to try to be better than its surrounding states, that could be a huge boom for Alabama. And that leads to the second issue, which is that we've found that economic freedom, particularly regulatory freedom, correlates with personal income growth. And so if you don't really care so much about freedom as an intrinsic value, you're not going to move. It doesn't affect your kind of decisions about that. But what you do care about is the bottom line, your paycheck. We see in our study evidence that freedom matters for that paycheck. And it also matters in the sense of, you know, do you want your children to have opportunities in your state? You know, do you want them to have to go to Texas to live so that they can, you know, have a good job and kind of live a good life?
Well, are there any final things you think our viewers should know about economic and personal freedom?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think about Alabama is that it has been moving in the right direction over the last 10 years. I mean, there's still a lot of room for growth, particularly in the personal freedom realm. But it has been moving in the right direction. It's one of, I think, 18 states that have had a net gain in terms of freedom over the last 10 years. And it is attracting citizens here. But there's so much more to do. And you know, and one of the things that our index does is it provides the data for individual citizens, for people in the press, for legislators, to kind of look and see how they compare. Because a lot of times if you're in a vacuum and you just see what's going on here, you know, and you see what happens around you, you don't realize what other states are doing. So for example, in Texas, I like to tell my friends in Texas, many of whom are enthusiasts for guns and hunting, I like to remind them that, you know, a real blue state, real liberal state like Vermont actually has greater freedom when it comes to gun rights than Texas does. And they're surprised by that in some cases. Really? You know? And so having this data available gives us that chance to see what others are doing. Or you know, think about occupational licensing. You know, you might say, well, hey, it would be, you know, unsafe to have someone who cuts my hair not have this training. And then you look at all the states that don't have that. There's not like a rash of incidents where people have been harmed greatly by their unlicensed hair braider.
Yeah.
And so it lets us get out of our zone and to look at what other states are doing.
Well, it's been very enjoyable. We could definitely go on with this conversation for a while, but we've come to the end of our time. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time for another EconVersation.